The building that we're in is, even by St James's Street standards, old and original. In fact, it's even older than the company here. Berry Brothers and Rudd can trace its roots back to 1698. But the building goes back to Tudor times, goes back to the days of Henry VIII. And he installed his mistress, Anne Boleyn, in St James's Palace, and promptly built a tennis court, tennis being his second most favourite activity, where he could get to it easily on this on this corner of St James's Street. So although the room we're sitting in looks very much like an ancient wine cellar, originally this would have been the changing room of the tennis courts of Henry VIII. So if there's a faint whiff of sock here, it comes from ancient Tudor royal socks. I don't think there is a faint whiff of socks, but still, that's what we tend to say down here. The building was taken over by a lady called the Widow Bourne in 1698, about 150 years after it was built. By that stage, it wasn't a tennis court. The Puritans had come along, and tennis had been banned as being much too much like fun. And at the end of the 17th century, this lady called the Widow Bourne, and we don't know anything else about her. We don't know her Christian name. The only thing we know is the poor unfortunate Mr. Bourne was dead. But she started a business here, selling not wine, interestingly enough, but tea and coffee. And although we're famous as being wine merchants, the history of our business goes back to a time when wine was not really a fashionable drink at all. If you go to 1698, the strange thing is that there are 4 drinks which the people of those days would say were the fashionable drinks. The first one was tea, which was incredibly expensive in those days. We sold tea, and you could buy the most expensive tea from us, which cost £10 a pound. And this was in a time when the average wage was £15 a year. So people were spending a large proportion of the average wage on a pound of tea, which is extraordinary now and makes even the most expensive wine seem particularly cheap in comparison. The other fashionable drink was coffee, which all of the coffee houses of St James's Street, which then became the clubs, were beginning to be set up, and we supplied all of those coffee houses with coffee beans. And originally, the name of the business, or the address of the business, dating back to the days when very few people could read, so you needed a sign on the outside of the building to tell you where you were. The name of the business was At the Sign of the Coffee Mill. So that was our principal trade, effectively. The other strange drink that was very fashionable in 1698, stranger to tell, was water. One of the things that you have to remember is that when people drank tea, or when they drank coffee, or when they drank beer, or when they drank wine, or when they drank spirits, what they were really doing was avoiding water, because water killed you. And for the first time in the mid-1690s, people were pumping fresh water into the centre of London, down a street which is now called Conduit Street. Surprise, surprise. So very close to here was a source, suddenly, of water that didn't kill you, and therefore it was almost like the days in the 70s and the 80s when bottled water suddenly became very fashionable. People were drinking water as a fashionable statement. And the other fashionable drink was gin. 1698 was the reign of William of Orange, and we were suddenly, having been at war with the Dutch for years and years and years and years and years, we had a Dutch king, and everything Dutch became very fashionable. And the Dutch favourite drink was Geneva, not named after the place in Switzerland, but after the Dutch for juniper. and it became very fashionable here. And indeed, there was a particular type of gin called London Dry Gin, which was brewed to suit the taste here. Interestingly enough, not very often made in London. It was very often made in Holland, but London gin was the style of it. That was the name of the style as opposed to where it came from. And people nowadays who say, oh, I want my London gin to be made in London. It's like saying you want your Dalmatians to be born in Dalmatia or your Ford Capris to be made in Capri. You know, it's not a appellation, it's not a provenance, it's just a name of a style. So gin was very, very fashionable. In fact, it became too fashionable, and about 30 years later, in the time of Hogarth, it had become everybody's sort of staple drink and was a bit of a problem. But for about 20 or 30 years, it was one of the really, really fashionable drinks. I suppose effectively what we were was grocers. We imported tea and coffee, but also gradually all sorts of groceries. But this again was a time when groceries were a lot more exotic than they are now. They by and large came from very, very distant lands. Something as humble now as nutmeg was the most expensive substance on the planet. Pepys describes exchanging a very large bag of gold for a very small bag of nutmeg. So groceries weren't quite what you nip down to your local supermarket to buy. And grocers also sold wine. I mean, you know, that isn't something invented by the Sainsbury's. That's something which people have done for years and years and years. It's probable, therefore, that we did sell a bit of wine. It wasn't our main trade, but it would have been sold on a small scale here. But what happened as far as the wine was concerned happened about 100 years later, in that my family, the Berry family, who were wine merchants in Exeter, married into the family who had inherited the business here, who by that stage were called the Clarks. And Mary Clark married John Berry in the 1790s, and their son George became the first member of my direct family to have his shop here, and he bought his father's wine merchant business with him, and gradually wine took over from groceries, wines and spirits as well. People again think of us as wine merchants, but our Royal Warrant, for example, is as wine and spirit merchants. We've always sold spirits, and we consider that to be part of what we do. It's part of our existence, as it were. I believe that great gin is one of the great drinks of the world. There's too much ordinary gin around, but really, really special gin is astonishingly good and undervalued and underpriced. I can remember the days when you could say that possibly about Scotch whisky, an old single malts we had on sale here for, we're going back to the 80s, so they were probably no more than 10 or 12 pounds a bottle, and the same things now sell for hundreds of pounds. But gin seems to have been passed by, probably because most of it's not very good. But really good gin, really absolutely first-class gin, you can still buy for 25, 30, 35 pounds a bottle. It's nobody's making anything that's astronomical, but the standard of it can be absolutely superb. Number 3, we started about a year ago now. I mean, we started thinking about it about 2 years, probably before that. And our spirits boys came to me and said, we think we ought to have an absolutely first-class gin. If we have one which has got our own name on it, what should it be? And I said, well, it's got to be the best. And they said, yes, well, that's a very easy thing to say. What does that mean precisely? And we're fortunate in St James's Street in being across the road from a bar which, in my opinion, makes probably the finest dry martinis in the world, and I've done extensive research to find out if this is true or not. And that's Duke's Hotel. Other bars are becoming extremely good now, but Duke's was a pioneer of making absolutely superb dry martinis. So I said to the boys who ran our spirits division, you can tell if it's the best if Duke's Hotel pour it in their bar. And I'm delighted to be able to say Duke's Hotel do pour it in their bar, so I think they've done a pretty good job. And it is superb. It's strangely enough, it's some of the new gins which have come out in the course of the last few years have tended to be rather complicated. There's been a trend to flavour them with rose petals and strange things that nobody ever thought of putting in gin before. And in a way, they're more flavoured vodkas, I think, than gins. But we were determined to sort of go back to the roots, to go back to the original London dry recipe. So juniper is something that comes through and through and through. And it does make a superb dry martini. The point about a dry martini is that it only really works if the gin is wonderful. And the reason why we said it would be a good thing if it was in Duke's is that if it's good enough for a good dry martini, it's got no place to hide. So when you come to mix it in other cocktails, it's sort of the gold standard of what gin should be. So I'm very proud of it. One of the wines that is in our case is a New Zealand Pinot Noir. And it's from a new producer that we haven't used before. And I had it for the first time last night. And it is delicious, and it tastes... It's one of the most perfect examples, I think, of a wine which isn't particularly pretentious. It's not terribly expensive, but it tastes as it ought to taste. It doesn't. It's made from the same grape as red Burgundy, but it doesn't taste like a red Burgundy. It sort of tastes like the Antipodean cousin of a red Burgundy, perhaps. You know that it's made from the same grape and that it's related, but it's been made in a different way with a different philosophy behind it. And that was a really exciting thing to taste. So, I mean, right now, if you ask me, that's my favourite wine, but that's because I happened to have it last night. It's strange. It is very like music in many ways. In that, I mean, I don't know if somebody says to me, what are your 7 favourite tunes? I wouldn't know. I'd say 700 I could possibly do. And that's why God invented the iPod, wasn't it? So that you could carry around, you can have all that choice. That's such a luxury to be able to pick a piece of music to suit a mood, or to pick a bottle of wine to suit a mood as well. It's a great luxury that we have. But you've always got to test yourself. You've always got to say, okay, well, I like this tune, or I like this artist, or I like this recording, or I like this wine. Is there something that I can now move to which is related to that, but which will expand my horizons a bit? And that, I think, is what wine merchants do best. That's what we do best. We have people here who take people on a journey, if you like, and help them discover this infinite variety of wines that exist out here.